Hello and welcome to our webcast for May 11, 2018. My name is Christian Debré and this is Amy Asbrook, the director of Toujours Vivant, Not Dead Yet.
Hello.
Okay. Not joining us this week, we have also Taylor Hyatt, our policy analysis and outreach coordinator. She will be there
She's
next
working
time.
in Ottawa.
Yes. So, Toujours Vivant, Not Dead Yet is a non-religious organization by and for people with disability and our allies. Our goal is to inform, unify, and give voice to the disability rights opposition to assisted suicide, euthanasia, and other end-of-life practices that discriminate against people with disabilities. Today's topics: two CBC radio interview, two approach to euthanasia, and both are very different.
Yeah. Okay. So last week, the CBC radio show The Current touched on euthanasia in two separate episodes. On May 1st, the host, Anna Maria Tremonti, interviewed the children of George and Shirley Brickenden. The Brickendens were the first couple in Canada to be euthanized at the same time. They died in March. On May 3rd, Ms. Tremonti spoke to Ing Wong Ward, a disability rights advocate, associate director of the Center for Independent Living in Toronto, currently on leave, and a former radio producer for the CBC. Ms. Wong Ward is currently receiving palliative care for cancer. She has been very open about her illness and her plan to not seek assisted suicide or euthanasia, ASE. Although both interviews concerned end-of-life issues, their stories were treated very differently.
Oh, yes.
Yes, and this is a lot about how reporters treat this issue. So that's what we're going to be talking about.
We was lucky because Miss Wang was a former CBC host herself.
Right. So she was given a lot of credibility, and she, even though she talked about her individual circumstance, she also, as a disability advocate, understood that she had to also talk about the social impact and political impact of the factors that influence people's decisions. And she did that as much as possible. But it's sort of frustrating when she, would ordinarily just talk about her situation, but as to be an advocate, she has to talk about the whole situation.
Yeah.
In the Brickendens case, the journalist never questioned the assumption that assisted dying was unrelated to suicide, nor did Ms. Tremonti challenge whether the desire for suicide was quote unquote rational or whether suicide prevention measures should have been tried.
They just don't talk about it at all.
Right. It didn't come up. There was no question about, well, gee, why did they want to commit suicide? That was never, other than the justification.
Yeah.
Their age, the Brickendens were both in their 90s.
They was very old.
Right.
Okay. We have to be honest. But the age doesn't have really an impact over the life or death of somebody, because even at 95 years old, a lot of people now live to 103
Right.
over 5 years old. So even after 95, you may have 10 years to live
Right.
in front of you.
Right. Okay. So their age, their declining health, and their need not to live without each other were offered as reason enough to justify helping them kill themselves. So, again, this is the whole thing about assisted suicide. Certain situations, certain life situations are seen as so bad that suicide is justified. And that's what they're doing. They're saying it's so bad to be old. It's so bad to have declining health that your suicide is justified. And nobody needs to intervene with suicide prevention services. Okay. Their children said the Brickendens were, quote, in constant pain, unquote, but never complained. They said George often helped Shirley with personal care tasks her arthritis made impossible.
I'm helped a lot of time.
Right. I help him with personal care tasks, and he helps me with personal care tasks.
Because my wife washed my feet because I have difficulty to bend to do that, or even to lift my legs. So she helped me a lot of time just to clean my feet.
Right.
And
exactly.
the showers. That's just a normal thing, and it's even fun.
Yeah. I'm pretty good at it.
Oh yeah, she's good.
Let's see. There was no discussion of how personal assistance services or better pain management could have improved the couple's quality of life. So again, it was given that their pain, when they said they had pain, rather than saying, why can't we manage this pain better? It just said, oh, reason for suicide.
Yeah.
You know.
So if it's a reason, I'm available to assess the suicide or euthanasia.
Right.
I have a lot of pain.
Right. I'm going to use the expression, shit flows downhill. Bad things tend to go in an easy direction.
Yeah.
And it's easier to think about killing yourself than it is to challenge the healthcare system to do a better job with pain management.
Yeah.
And so when people say, oh, you know, I'm in such pain, they blame their disabilities rather than the health system. And so that's why people end up killing themselves. The Brickinsons' death was portrayed as a real-life version of those romantic stories about loving couples who die at the same time.
They die at the same time. Very romantic.
Right, but in this case,
Romeo
it was
and
arranged.
Juliet.
Right.
Okay. No.
The Brickenden children said that their parents had discussed ending their lives, or flying away, as they called it, together for 40 years.
The spirit just flow away when you die. You'll be, know.
Yeah, except.
But that's not the real thing happening. Okay?
Right.
That is never easy, even if it's when it's qualified.
Right, and again, we've talked about this before, but you know, people with or without cognitive disabilities don't necessarily understand what they're getting into. They say, "Oh, I'm going to go to sleep. I won't be tired anymore." But,
yeah,
you know, it won't be anything anymore.
There will be nobody to feel better.
Right. Okay. Romanticizing suicide is one of the practices discouraged by the Canadian Association for Suicide Prevention in their guidelines on reporting on suicide.
Have you heard about the suicide in the metro?
Right.
But there is plenty of it. But nobody talk about it because they know that if you talk, there is a lot more. That's universal. Every town who have a metro do that normally.
Right. Media are encouraged to exercise restraint in reporting about suicide because of the potential that others in a similar situation might be inspired to emulate those who commit suicide. Hey, duh. It's called the contagion effect. And, you know, you don't give an example of, hey, here's what to do and here's how to do it. Bad idea.
Yeah.
And you certainly don't make celebrities out of the people who do it. Other World Health Organization, World Health Organization suicide reporting guidelines that the current program violates include normalizing suicide. So the report emphasized the large number of people who've been euthanized since the practice became legal 2 years ago. And the response to the Brickendens' story was described as unbelievably positive. So they're trying to make it normal.
Which is not a thing to do at all.
Right.
Any kind of suicide.
Right. If you want to prevent suicide, you don't make it normal.
Yeah. And even if there are old people, younger will have tendency to take examples from them. Okay.
Right.
So it's not good. A suicide is a suicide, whatever the way you do it.
Right. Another practice that they shouldn't be doing, but they did, was glorifying suicide. The interview describes the family's celebration of the euthanasia, and the webpage features a family photo at their final dinner together. And this is a big family photo, and everybody. wait a minute, this is supposed to be a suicide. A suicide is not supposed to be good. We're not promoting suicide. We are trying to prevent suicide. And if you celebrate suicide, that's not preventing it.
No.
So, preventing suicide as a solution to problems, that was another thing they're doing. The Brickendens were described as exhausted, visiting the hospital multiple times per week. There was no discussion of the role of poor health care or pain management in inducing their suicides, nor of the potential for adaptive clothing or personal assistance services to enable the Brickendens to remain independent.
Speak slowly, please. Speak a lot slowly.
Yes. It was the only solution that was proposed as reasonable was euthanasia. Okay, the other thing, of course, that they were doing in this report was describing in detail the method used and the site of the suicide, which was the whole thing about assisted suicide and what they do when they report on it. They describe what it is and where it happens. Mr. Brickenden's request to die was not approved until his health declined at the beginning of this year. And this was interpreted in the interview as a sign that the safeguards included in the law worked.
Which is not true.
Right. Right.
That's a sign that the system worked.
Right. It's a sign that he wasn't eligible at a certain time under the criteria and that he was later. But the fact that Mr. Brickenden's death was delayed does not mean that the safeguards protected him from external pressures that limited his choices, made him feel devalued, or degraded his quality of life, even through coercion or lack of needed services and supports. So just because he wasn't eligible at one moment and then he was eligible at another moment doesn't mean that the safeguards that are supposed to protect vulnerable people worked.
Yeah, because even if he was delayed, he asked for, but doesn't mean that the way he asked was not induced by some pressure of any kind.
Right, and they talked about the pressure of the pain. They talked about feeling ill and not getting, if they had to end up at the emergency room so many times per week, then there's something wrong with their healthcare management.
Yeah. Must be, because you don't go at the hospital a few times a week because your thing is working properly.
Right. They're not getting good follow-up.
No.
Right. Some quotes from the Brickenden family stand out. Pamela Brickenden mentioned that dying with dignity is better than a botched suicide. So even though promoters of assisted suicide say it's not really suicide, here she is admitting that it's suicide.
Yeah.
A traditional suicide would probably be messier, more painful, and traumatizing for the loved ones left behind.
So they admit this is a suicide.
Right, exactly.
Okay. What is the logic about that? Right. There's no logic.
Right. Well, they want to have it both ways. This statement recognized that assisted suicide and euthanasia is, in fact, about suicide, despite advocates' claim to the contrary. Oh, there's the cat.
Yeah, and a cat video. Yeah.
Right. Yet no one mentioned suicide prevention or questioned whether suicide was an appropriate response to the Brickenden situation. They were still very happy being together. They had some health issues, but they still were happy being together. And if they had had better pain management, maybe they wouldn't have wanted to die.
Yeah, maybe they doesn't want to die if
right.
They have no more pain management.
Right. Any possible objections to assisted suicide and euthanasia were ignored or dismissed, using the defense of individual choice. In her only direct challenge to the Brickendens' narrative, Ms. Tremonti asked whether a loss of physical or mental abilities necessarily meant a person lacked dignity. Pamela Brickenden sidestepped the question, saying instead, I think it's a personal choice. I don't think it's for everybody, and it shouldn't be. So, when somebody feels devalued, because they get the message constantly from society that it's better to be dead than disabled. That's not their fault. It's the fault of the message, and it's not a choice to feel devalued because you're constantly getting this message. It's like saying people of color have a choice whether to feel devalued by racism. No, it's just, no, no, it doesn't work. The siblings cited the support of local religious figures to suggest that even moral objections to assisted suicide and euthanasia are not strongly held. Arguments made by disability rights advocates didn't even register. And that's the problem. And when we talk about the issue of suicide prevention, again, we get to the issue, either we have a policy for suicide prevention that applies to everybody, or we don't.
Suicide for everybody.
Right.
That's the other way.
Right. So,
but I don't like it this way.
Right. Right. As it is, we have a policy for suicide prevention that not all people. Okay. Though her interview was focused on her individual situation, Wong Ward acknowledged the barriers that push disabled people toward the quote-unquote choice of assisted suicide and euthanasia. She highlighted American disability rights activists who were arrested for protesting cuts in Medicaid, noting how easy we have it in Canada by comparison. And, you know, that's been true for people with disabilities have had to fight to keep the public health insurance in the United States, keep cuts from being made to the services and the coverage of that. So that's what they
have
doing.
Only one small advantage. The money normally follow the people.
Well, even it's supposed to, but it's supposed to.
But not everybody have the money.
Yeah, and there's still the interests. The institutional people who run institutions still have a great deal of power in controlling where the money goes. So it doesn't always work out that way. Let's see. And like she didn't, oops, don't do that. It doesn't help. And like many other disabled advocates, Ms. Wong Ward mentioned that she didn't want to be considered inspiring for performing everyday tasks. Okay, so she said that specifically, and we'll get to that again in a minute. When the conversation turned to assisted suicide, Ms. Tremonti observed that, quote, not everyone who meets the criteria for an assisted death will see it as right for them, unquote, which seemed to imply that assisted suicide and euthanasia has become the default option for old, ill, and disabled people.
Which is not the case, and it must not be the case.
Right, exactly.
That's not for everybody.
Yes.
And even that, they sold it for a very, very, very small portion of the debt, 100 a year. In Canada, there's more than 2,000 now a year, but they sold it like for all Canada, maybe 100 that a year.
Right, 100. And when you say it's not for everybody, that means it's for a lot of people. That's not good. Not good at all. Ms. Wong Ward explained that she is uncomfortable with the phrase dying with dignity, since it implies that people who need assistance to eat, to use the bathroom, or communicate somehow lack dignity. Death is not the only way to deal with bodily limitations, she said. And that's a very important message. It was great that she got that message out, and God knows if anybody heard it. She also called for a greater understanding of who is choosing to end their lives and why they are making the decision. For example, quote, people are not able to access public palliative care, hospice care, or other community supports in a timely fashion. Again, she's using her individual situation, but she's also talking about the larger social circumstance that forces people to ask for assisted suicide. Social isolation comes into play as well, but Ms. Wong Ward is grateful for the support of her family and friends. At the end of the interview, Ms. Tremonti felt it necessary to say that Ing Wong Ward is one of those people who made me cry. In doing so, she appears to disregard Ms. Wong Ward's preference not to be considered inspiring. So they had this discussion about, I'm not inspiring, please don't think of me that way. Because when people say, oh, you're so inspiring, it's like they're putting distance between you and them. They're saying, you're over there, you're different from me, you're not really the same as me, and so I can keep you at arm's length, and we're not the same. And even though they're sort of ostensibly doing it in a nice way, it doesn't work that way. And the feminist movement has known that for a long time. They talk about when you put women on pedestals, that's just as oppressive as, being physically abusive. And the same holds true. So when Anna Maria Tremonti basically disregards what Ing Wong Ward said and says, she made me cry, it's like, oh man, so much for respect. These two interviews demonstrate the ongoing problems of reporting about assisted suicide and euthanasia. Journalists have a very superficial view of the issue. They don't understand the potential causes of abuse and coercion, or see the impact of barriers and discrimination on the quote-unquote choice to die. And that was very clear from the interview. They are unaware of the double standard that says that suicidal feelings of old, ill, and disabled people aren't worthy of suicide prevention intervention.
Yeah, most interviewer doesn't have a damn idea about what they talk about it.
Right. And, it's understandable that journalists don't know everything about everything, but when you're talking about an issue that has so much impact on a grand social scale, that where people's lives are at stake, really it behooves you to at least comply with the reporting guidelines.
Yes, that's a minimum.
Right.
And they should look at both sides, which they don't do normally.
Right, because they don't understand that there's another side.
Yeah.
And that's
so they doesn't even
inexcusable.
Scratch the minimum of the subject.
Right.
And they just talk about general things admitted by everybody, which are false.
Right. Because they focus on individual cases, journalists are unaware of the larger social and political problems associated with assisted suicide and euthanasia. And journalists continue to ignore the guidelines for reporting on suicide when covering assisted suicide and euthanasia, because they have accepted the propaganda of assisted suicide proponents that assisted suicide is not suicide. It's suicide.
Yeah, a
Same
suicide
causes.
is a suicide, whatever is the age of or the condition of people.
Right. And it doesn't make any sense to say that a person who has X characteristic, if they express some feelings, it's not suicide, but a person who has Y characteristic, if they express the same feelings, that's suicide. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. The minimum is to admit that a suicide is a suicide. And if somebody really, really, really wants to kill himself, okay, we could not stop it every time. But we should admit that suicide is a suicide.
And if we're going to have a suicide prevention policy, we need to apply it.
Yes, that's a minimum.
Everybody.
Or if you don't do that, it's suicide for everybody.
Right, exactly. Also, the final issue of reporting is that assisted suicide and euthanasia are becoming the default option for end-of-life care. When people talk favorably about assisted suicide and euthanasia, it is assumed they are speaking for the majority, but when they refuse assisted suicide and euthanasia, their choice is considered unusual and inspiring. So they're outliers. They're weird because they're refusing it. They're not normal.
I wish we will never reach that point for the whole population.
Right.
That will be a great disaster.
Yeah. Because journalists rarely encounter old, ill, or disabled people in everyday situations due to continuing segregation, they share the same fears, discomfort, and insecurities about disabilities as the rest of the population. As a result, disability is shown as other or different, either as frightening or as a source of inspiration, regardless of the person's preference. We've mentioned in previous webcasts that TV and radio can provide a safe setting for non-disabled people to confront their discomfort about disability. But in order for this strategy to work, the public needs to be given detailed and accurate information.
This is a right.
About the policies that affect us, especially assisted suicide and euthanasia.
Yeah, receiving real information, truth information, right, is a right.
Right. Well, yeah. So, for more information about the subjects that we discuss here, you can visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/toujours. You can visit our website at tvndy.ca. Email us at info@tv-ndy.ca or follow us on Twitter @TVNDY. Thanks to Christian for helping us out. And thanks to you all for being there. We will see you next time.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.